Grant Calloway's faded canvas bag looked like it had no business sitting inside the white leather cabin of CEO Serafina Kingsley Vale's private jet. So in front of the entire flight crew, she ordered her security chief to search it, as though Grant were some beggar who had wandered into a world built for the wealthy. Grant did not resist. He simply glanced at the $40 million aircraft gleaming beyond the terminal glass and said, "Be careful with what is in the inner pocket." When the item was pulled out, the entire cabin fell silent, because the flight had just been grounded. If you enjoy satisfying twists that leave you breathless, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next story on this channel. Rockwell Ridge Executive Terminal sat on the eastern edge of Colorado's high plains, where the air ran thin and the money ran thick. On this particular Tuesday morning, the tarmac gleamed under a cloudless sky, and a silver-white Gulfstream bearing the crest of Vailcrest Aviation Holdings idled near the private boarding gate with its engines already cycling through their pre-flight warm-up sequence. Ground crew in crisp Navy uniforms moved with the quiet urgency of people who understood that every second on this runway belonged to someone who measured time in millions, and no one measured it more precisely than Serafina Kingsley Vale. She emerged from a black armored sedan wearing a charcoal cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her dark sunglasses reflecting the terminal's glass facade. Her silver-streaked hair swept back with the kind of discipline that suggested everything in her world obeyed a schedule. Two assistants trailed behind her carrying leather folios, and flanking the boarding stairs stood Blaine Ashford, her head of private security, along with two of his uniformed men, their hands clasped in front of them like palace guards awaiting a queen. This flight to Dallas was not merely a trip but a coronation of sorts, because waiting at the other end was Preston Whitaker III, chairman of Whitaker Dominion Capital, and his signature on a $120 million investment that would transform Vailcrest's luxury charter fleet from a regional operation into a nationwide empire. Grant Calloway appeared at the terminal entrance looking like a man who had taken a wrong turn at the cargo hangar. His mechanic's jacket was faded at the collar and elbows. His boots carried the honest scuff marks of someone who spent more time under aircraft than inside them, and slung over his shoulder was a canvas bag so old that its original color had surrendered to years of oil stains and Colorado dust. He walked with the measured calm of a man who had seen enough cockpits and engine bays to know that rushing never fixed anything, and when he reached the boarding area, Madison Greer, Vailcrest's director of flight operations, met him with a handshake that carried more tension than warmth. She had called him before dawn because the jet's cabin pressure system had logged its third anomaly in 7 days, and two in-house technicians had already reset the error codes without ever identifying the root cause. Madison knew something was wrong, but Serafina had made it violently clear that the aircraft would depart on schedule because Preston Whitaker did not wait for anyone, and anyone who suggested otherwise would be volunteering for a career change. Serafina noticed Grant the moment he stepped past the velvet rope, and her expression shifted from regal composure to undisguised contempt in the span of a single breath. In her eyes, a man dressed like a weekend handyman had no place boarding her jet, especially not when a billionaire investor would soon be reviewing every detail of Vailcrest's operation for signs of excellence. Grant offered no elaborate introduction, simply stating that he needed to inspect the aft technical compartment before the aircraft left the runway, and Madison nodded beside him with the nervous energy of someone standing between a lit match and a fuel tank. Blaine Ashford stepped forward, blocking Grant's path with the casual authority of a man who enjoyed the physical dimensions of his job, and asked what was in the bag. Grant answered without blinking, his voice as level as a horizon line, tools and paperwork relevant to this flight. Serafina overheard the exchange, and her irritation crystallized into a direct command that echoed through the cabin doorway. She said to search his bag, every pocket, because nobody carried anything suspicious onto her aircraft. Grant did not argue, did not stiffen, did not raise his voice. He set the canvas bag on the nearest leather seat, looked Serafina in the eye, and said quietly, "You can look through everything in there. But do not pretend that after you open it, you will still want to take off." Blaine unzipped the bag with the theatrical slowness of a man who wanted everyone watching to understand who held the power on this tarmac. He pulled out each item and placed it on the polished walnut table between the forward seats as though cataloging evidence from a crime scene. A small flashlight with scratches along its barrel, an analog pressure gauge wrapped in a cloth sleeve, a pocket notebook filled with dense handwriting, a box of marking pens, and a handful of sealed inspection bolts still in their factory packaging. Serafina watched with a thin smile that sharpened with every ordinary object that emerged, and when the table held nothing but a mechanic's everyday kit, she turned to Grant and asked whether he seriously intended to service a $40 million aircraft with what looked like a collection from a weekend flea market. A few crew members produced strained laughs, the kind that people offer when they are not sure whether the joke is funny, but are very sure the person telling it signs their paychecks. Grant said nothing in return, his gaze fixed not on Serafina but on Blaine's hands, as though he were patiently waiting for the security chief to reach the one thing that mattered. Blaine's fingers found the inner compartment of the bag, a zippered section reinforced with a stiff cardboard liner, and from it he withdrew a rigid gray envelope sealed with an embossed stamp that caught the cabin light like a warning flare. Across the top of the envelope ran the insignia of the Federal Airworthiness Review Board, and beneath it, printed in bold block letters that left no room for interpretation, were the words "Immediate Technical Hold, Pending Independent Clearance." The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted as though someone had opened an emergency exit at altitude. Madison's face drained of color because she understood exactly what that envelope meant, and the captain, who had been monitoring from the cockpit doorway, turned fully around to stare at the document in Blaine's hands. Serafina had not yet grasped the full weight of what she was seeing, but she could read the room well enough to know that the reactions around her were not the responses of people looking at a piece of meaningless paperwork. Blaine started to tear the seal with his thumb, and Grant spoke so softly that every person in the cabin had to lean closer to hear him. "That seal has my name on it. If you break it improperly, the first order of business will not be flying. It will be a formal accounting of who tampered with a federal airworthiness document." Blaine's hand froze mid-motion, his confidence retreating behind a mask of uncertainty, and Madison stepped forward to read the name printed on the envelope's chain of custody line. Grant Calloway, Independent Airworthiness Examiner. The title hung in the recycled cabin air like a verdict. This was not some freelance grease monkey trying to upsell a repair job. This was a federally recognized inspector with the authority to recommend that any aircraft, private or commercial, be grounded until an independent review confirmed its safety. Serafina recovered quickly, or at least tried to, folding her arms and declaring that the envelope was probably an old credential Grant carried around to inflate his importance. Grant corrected her without raising his voice, explaining that the document had been issued at 6:10 that morning, after the jet's cabin pressure system had logged its third deviation in 7 days, and that the hold was active as of the moment the seal was stamped. The captain cleared his throat and announced that he could not authorize departure until he had reviewed the contents of Grant's file in full, because federal protocol did not bend for scheduling convenience. In the space of 3 minutes, Serafina had gone from the woman giving orders to the woman being held in place by the very procedures she had always considered beneath her attention. The story pulled back a few hours to a small workshop near the airport perimeter, a corrugated metal building with a hand-painted sign that read Callaway Field Mechanics. Inside, Grant had been replacing a hydraulic seal on a crop duster when his phone buzzed with a text from his son Nolan, asking whether Dad would be home for dinner. Grant typed back that he had to inspect an aircraft first, but would try to make it home early. Then set the phone on the workbench and returned to the task at hand with the quiet focus of a man who had learned long ago that the people who mattered most in his life understood the demands of his work without needing speeches about sacrifice. Madison Greer's call had come in before sunrise, her voice tight with the particular anxiety of someone who knew she was about to ask a favor that could put both of them in an uncomfortable position. The jet belonging to Serafina Kingsley-Vale had been flagging intermittent cabin pressure warnings for nearly a week, and 2 Valecrest technicians had reset the error codes each time without ever tracing the fault to its origin, partly because the schedule left no window for deep diagnostics, and partly because Serafina had made it clear that the Dallas flight would not be delayed for anything short of a visible crack in the fuselage. Grant had spent 14 years as an airworthiness certification engineer before stepping away from the corporate side of aviation, and during that time he had earned a reputation that made him simultaneously invaluable and unwelcome. He never signed off on an aircraft unless the data was clean, and clean meant every sensor reading, every maintenance log, every parts receipt had to tell the same story without contradiction. Several private aviation firms had quietly blacklisted him because his thoroughness added days to their turnaround schedules. But the institutional investors who underwrote those firms trusted his name more than any glossy safety brochure. When Madison sent him the maintenance logs that morning, Grant noticed something that turned a routine pressure warning into a serious concern. The anomaly was not random sensor noise or a software glitch. It traced back to a cabin pressure regulating valve that had been replaced during the most recent scheduled maintenance with a component from a parts lot that did not match the aircraft manufacturer's approved specifications. Someone had installed a cheaper substitute, and the paperwork had been signed off without a flag. Grant assembled a formal technical hold file, sealed it with his credentials, and packed it into the inner compartment of his canvas bag alongside a second item that he knew might prove decisive. Madison had asked him to come aboard and present his findings directly because Serafina refused to delay the flight based on what she called a warning on paper. Grant agreed, not because the job paid well or because he enjoyed confrontation, but because if that jet lifted off with an unresolved pressure valve issue, every crew member aboard would be carrying a risk they had not consented to, and every signature in the maintenance chain would become a liability waiting to detonate. Back in the present moment, standing inside the gleaming cabin while Serafina glared at him, and the captain waited for answers, the full picture became clear. Grant had not snuck aboard. He had not talked his way past security. He was the only person on that tarmac with the authority to determine whether the aircraft was legally permitted to fly. Madison turned to Serafina and said, almost in a whisper, "Ma'am, Mr. Callaway did not come here to ask permission to board your plane. He came here to decide whether your plane is allowed to leave the ground." Serafina Kingsley-Vale had not built a $200 million aviation empire by accepting defeat gracefully, and she was not about to start in front of her own flight crew. She instructed Madison to contact Valecrest's chief of maintenance and have him confirm by phone that the aircraft was airworthy, and Madison reluctantly dialed the number while the cabin waited in a silence thick enough to muffle footsteps. The chief of maintenance, a careful man named Douglas who had survived 15 years at Valecrest by never committing to anything in writing that could come back to haunt him, offered the most cautious answer imaginable. He said there was no direct evidence of imminent danger but stopped conspicuously short of certifying the aircraft safe for departure. Serafina turned on Grant with a voice that could have frosted the cabin windows, asking him directly how much money it would take to rewrite his report in softer language so the flight could proceed. Grant looked at her the way a surgeon might look at someone who had just asked him to skip the anesthesia because it was taking too long, and he answered that a technical report was not a price list. Serafina shifted tactics with the fluidity of someone accustomed to wielding power from multiple angles. She reminded Grant that Vailcrest Aviation Holdings retained a legal team capable of burying his small-town garage under enough litigation to keep him in court until his son graduated college, and that delaying the Whitaker meeting could cost her company a deal worth more than Grant would earn in 10 lifetimes. Grant absorbed the threat without flinching, his expression unchanged, and requested permission to physically inspect the aft technical compartment and the pressure-regulating valve assembly while the aircraft remained on the ground. Blaine interjected that Grant was exploiting a single piece of paper to hold an entire corporation hostage, but the captain cut him off with a firmness that surprised everyone. Federal aviation regulations, even for private operations, placed ultimate responsibility for flight safety on the pilot in command, and once a formal technical hold document had been presented, the captain could not legally disregard it regardless of who owned the aircraft. The atmosphere inside the cabin completed its reversal. Minutes earlier, every eye had looked at Grant as though he were an intruder who had wandered into the wrong tax bracket. Now those same eyes waited for him to speak, because he was the only person in the room holding actual data instead of opinions wrapped in authority. Serafina ordered the remaining passengers to stay seated and instructed the crew to begin pre-departure procedures. The captain refused. On her own aircraft, surrounded by her own employees, breathing her own recycled air, Serafina Kingsley-Vale had just been overruled by a set of rules she had always assumed applied to other people. Grant opened the gray envelope carefully, broke the seal along its perforated line, and spread the pages across the walnut table one by one. Cabin pressure deviation charts spanning 7 days, maintenance error codes with timestamps, a log of every system reset performed without root cause analysis, high-resolution photographs of the non-conforming valve component taken during a previous inspection of the same parts lot, and at the bottom of the stack, the Vailcrest internal approval chain showing who had authorized the substitution. Madison leaned over the table and her breath caught when she recognized the pattern. The substitute parts had been approved not by the maintenance department acting independently, but by the Executive Operations Office, specifically to shorten turnaround time before a series of demonstration flights designed to impress Preston Whitaker. The fault was not merely technical, it was administrative, woven into the very decision-making structure that Serafina commanded. Serafina stared at the final page in the approval chain and saw her own digital signature at the bottom, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier. She was quiet for several seconds, long enough for the cabin's environmental system to cycle audibly through its vents, and then she said, "I do not remember signing this." Grant did not look up from the documents. He simply replied, "The aircraft remembers." Grant reached into the canvas bag one more time and withdrew a small plastic case no larger than a paperback novel. Inside, cradled in a foam cutout, sat a cabin pressure-regulating valve identical in model and lot number to the one currently installed in Serafina's jet. This was the item, the one item referenced in hushed tones later by everyone who had been present that morning. It was not large, not shiny, not expensive. It would not have turned a single head at a hardware store. But printed on its side was a manufacturer's lot code that matched the aircraft's maintenance records, a regulatory warning label indicating the batch had been removed from the approved parts directory. and along the edge of its pressure gasket, visible only under close inspection, ran a hairline fracture so fine it looked like a strand of spider silk caught in industrial resin. Grant held the valve at eye level so the cabin light illuminated the fracture, and he explained in the plain language of a man who had spent his career translating engineering complexity into words that pilots, executives, and regulators could all understand. If the gasket failed at cruising altitude, the aircraft would not experience a catastrophic depressurization event. What would happen instead was more insidious. The system would begin compensating silently until it reached the limit of its tolerance, at which point an emergency descent protocol would trigger automatically, forcing the jet to drop altitude rapidly enough to cancel the flight plan, divert to the nearest available runway, and generate the kind of regulatory incident report that could jeopardize Vailcrest's entire operating certificate. He was not trying to frighten anyone. He was stating facts in the measured tone of a man who understood that truth does not need volume to command a room. Serafina attempted a counterattack, arguing that a sample component from the same lot did not constitute proof that her specific aircraft was compromised. Grant gestured toward the data spread across the table. The lot codes matched, the installation dates matched, the approval signatures matched. Madison called for the aft technical panel to be opened immediately. 2 technicians removed the access cover, located the pressure valve assembly, and compared its markings against the sample Grant had brought aboard. After several minutes of cross-referencing serial numbers and lot stamps, the lead technician looked up and confirmed that the installed component carried an identical batch code to the fractured sample resting on the cabin table. The silence that settled over the Gulfstream's interior was the kind that makes even confident people examine their fingernails. The crew members who had laughed at Grant's tools lowered their eyes. Blaine stepped back from the canvas bag as though it had grown teeth. The captain formally declared the flight canceled until the valve was replaced, and a full independent inspection had been completed, and his voice carried the finality of a man who understood that no amount of money could put the words back into the bottle Grant had just uncorked. Serafina's composure fractured along lines she had not known existed, but she was boxed in by geometry she could not rearrange. If she pressured the pilot to fly, the captain could refuse and file a report. If she overrode Madison, the operations director could document the interference. And if she challenged Grant, the examiner could transmit his entire file to the Federal Safety Board before the jet's auxiliary power unit finished its cooldown cycle. At that moment, the cabin's communication screen chimed with an incoming video call from Dallas. Preston Whitaker III's name appeared on the display, and the question he was about to ask was one Serafina had been dreading since the gray envelope first emerged from that old canvas bag. Why had the aircraft not departed on schedule? Serafina began composing an answer involving a minor mechanical hiccup, but Grant was standing 3 feet from the screen with a fractured valve in one hand and a stack of federal documents in the other. Preston Whitaker III appeared on the widescreen display, mounted in the jet's forward conference area, his image crisp enough to reveal the kind of calm that only decades of controlling billion-dollar outcomes can produce. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture dramatically, did not need to, because the stillness in his expression carried more authority than any boardroom theatrics ever could. Serafina launched into her prepared narrative immediately, describing the delay as a minor technical misunderstanding caused by an overzealous outside contractor who had escalated a routine inspection beyond its appropriate scope. She used the same tone she employed when dismissing quarterly earnings concerns at shareholder meetings, smooth, practiced, and designed to make the listener feel foolish for worrying in the first place. She referred to Grant as a local mechanic who had inserted himself into a process he did not fully understand. Preston listened without interrupting until Serafina mentioned Grant's name, and then he paused her with a single raised finger. He asked whether she was referring to Grant Calloway, the same Grant Calloway who had written the airworthiness certification standards for the Northline fleet 8 years ago. The cabin fell silent for what felt like the 4th or 5th time that morning, and the silences were growing heavier with each repetition. Grant confirmed with a brief nod visible on the screen. Preston explained, in the unhurried manner of a man who did his homework before writing checks, that he had read Grant's Northline report years earlier, when a potential aviation acquisition had nearly collapsed due to undisclosed maintenance shortcuts, and that Grant's early detection of structural compromises had saved the deal's investors from what would have been a catastrophic financial and legal exposure. In Preston's world, Grant Calloway's signature on a safety document carried more weight than any CEO's verbal assurance, especially a CEO who was visibly rushing to close a deal. Preston asked Grant to present his findings directly, bypassing Serafina entirely, and the request landed in the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Grant spoke clearly and without embellishment. The aircraft should not depart. The valve component had been sourced from a delisted parts lot. The substitution originated from an executive decision to compress maintenance timelines ahead of investor demonstration flights. And if Vailcrest was applying these same shortcuts across its entire fleet, the $120 million investment deserved to be paused until an independent audit could determine the true scope of the problem. Serafina tried to interrupt, and Preston told her to remain silent until Grant had finished speaking. The instruction was delivered with the courteous detachment of a man returning a dish at a restaurant, polite, final, and utterly indifferent to the chef's feelings. The woman who had ordered a stranger's bag searched in front of her own crew was now being told to sit quietly by the very investor whose approval she had spent months cultivating. Madison Greer found her courage in the space Preston's authority had created. She confirmed on camera that Grant had been contacted through proper channels, that she had personally flagged the pressure anomalies to her superiors earlier in the week, and that her warnings had been met with instructions to reset the error codes and maintain the flight schedule. Her voice trembled at the start but steadied as she spoke, the way a bridge sways before it locks into the load it was designed to bear. Serafina looked at Madison the way monarchs look at courtiers who have switched allegiances mid-battle, but Madison did not retreat. She said she could not allow the flight crew to absorb a risk that existed solely because the CEO did not want to be late to a meeting. Preston listened, nodded once, and announced that the investment signing was postponed indefinitely. He directed that Vailcrest's complete maintenance records be transferred to an independent audit team of his choosing, and he named Grant Calloway as the principal safety advisor for the review. Serafina refused to accept the outcome as final. After the passengers had been escorted off the aircraft and the crew had begun securing the cabin, she pulled Blaine and 2 members of her legal team into the terminal's private lounge and began constructing a counter-narrative designed to discredit Grant before his report could reach Preston's desk. Blaine discovered that Grant had departed a major aviation corporation years earlier following an internal dispute, and Serafina seized on that detail like a prosecutor who had found a prior conviction. She instructed her legal team to draft an internal memo characterizing the delay as the work of a disgruntled, independent contractor with a documented history of conflict within the industry, and she wanted it delivered to Whitaker before Grant submitted his formal findings. Grant learned about the memo through Madison, who forwarded it with the quiet defiance of someone who had already crossed the line and saw no reason to step back. He was not surprised. He had spent enough years telling powerful people things they did not want to hear to know that the first response was always to attack the messenger rather than examine the message. He asked Madison to preserve every internal communication from the past 2 weeks, every email chain, every maintenance log modification, every directive to reset error codes, and every scheduling override that had been issued from the executive suite. The records were not weapons. They were context, and context, Grant had learned, was the one thing that liars could not survive. The confrontation that followed took place in the terminal lounge, where Serafina stood behind a mahogany table as though it were a barricade. She accused Grant of dismantling her company to satisfy some personal grudge against the aviation establishment. Grant replied that she was the one who had proven his relevance by ordering his bag searched in front of a cabin full of witnesses without knowing that the bag contained the only thing standing between her aircraft and a regulatory nightmare. Serafina changed tactics and mentioned Grant's son, suggesting that a man with a child to support should think carefully about picking fights with an organization that had the resources to make his professional life extremely uncomfortable. Grant's expression cooled by several degrees, but he did not erupt. He said, "Keep my family out of your maintenance failures." The line was quiet, final, and carried the weight of a man who had drawn a boundary that no amount of corporate leverage could move. Grant's decisive countermove came not from emotion but from data. Among the records Madison had preserved was an internal email thread in which the pressure warnings had been flagged by a junior technician, escalated to Madison, forwarded to the operations executive, and returned with a single annotation that read "defer until after investor flight." That phrase, 6 words long, proved that the decision to fly with a known anomaly had not been an oversight or a miscommunication. It had been a deliberate choice to prioritize optics over safety, and the authorization chain led directly to Serafina's office. By the end of the day, Preston Whitaker had received both documents. The polished memo attempting to discredit Grant in the raw data trail, proving that Vailcrest's leadership had knowingly deferred a safety concern to protect a business meeting. Preston's response arrived in a single sentence. "Tomorrow morning, I want the truth presented in a conference room." The meeting convened the following morning in a temporary office suite that Whitaker Dominion Capital maintained at the airport for regional due diligence sessions. The room was functional rather than luxurious, with a long table, a projector screen, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that flattered no one. Present were Preston Whitaker, Serafina Kingsley-Vail, Madison Greer, the Gulfstream's captain, 2 Vailcrest attorneys, and Grant Calloway, who arrived carrying the same canvas bag that had started the entire sequence of events. Serafina entered in a tailored navy suit, her posture calibrated to project the authority that had been leaking from her grip since the previous morning. She opened with a prepared statement about Vailcrest's vision, describing a fleet of luxury private aircraft offering unparalleled safety and service to the nation's most discerning clientele, and she framed the technical issue as a minor deviation that had been amplified beyond its actual significance by an outside party with limited understanding of corporate aviation's operational realities. Preston stopped her politely and asked Grant to speak first. Grant placed the canvas bag on the table, and the image carried a symbolism that no one in the room could miss. The same bag that had been searched, mocked, and treated as evidence of its owner's unworthiness was now the centerpiece of a meeting that would determine the future of a $120 million investment. He opened it and laid out each piece of evidence in sequence. The technical hold envelope, the fractured valve sample, the photographs of the installed component, the maintenance reset logs, the parts approval chain, and the deferred warning email thread. He did not mention the humiliation at the boarding gate. He did not describe how Serafina had tried to bribe him or threaten his livelihood. He let the data speak in the language it was designed for. One of Serafina's attorneys attempted to undermine Grant's credibility by asking whether he would acknowledge that he had left a major aviation firm under disputed circumstances. Grant answered without hesitation that he had resigned because the firm had asked him to certify a fleet that had not met inspection standards, and that within 6 months of his departure, the fleet in question had been grounded for the exact deficiencies he had identified. The attorney did not ask a follow-up question. Preston turned to Madison and asked directly whether she had been pressured to suppress safety warnings. Madison paused, took a breath that seemed to draw somewhere deeper than her lungs, and confirmed everything. The captain added that without the documentation Grant had carried aboard in his bag, the flight would almost certainly have departed under executive pressure, and no one in the chain of command below Serafina had possessed either the authority or the evidence to stop it. Serafina's composure began to fracture in ways she could not conceal. She argued that every chief executive in aviation had to balance risk against time, that delays cost money, and that perfection was the enemy of operations. Preston looked at her across the table and replied that no one balanced safety by sweeping it under a carpet. Then he made his announcement. Whitaker Dominion Capital was withdrawing its $120 million investment commitment to Vailcrest Aviation Holdings, effective immediately. Furthermore, his firm would establish an independent safety certification unit as a prerequisite before any future aviation investment, and he turned to Grant and asked whether he would be willing to help build the standards for that initiative. Serafina sat in the silence that followed Preston's announcement, like a woman watching a building she had spent years constructing fold inward floor by floor. She had boarded her jet that morning, worried about being a few minutes late to a meeting. Now she had lost the investment entirely, forfeited the trust of the most influential capital partner in private aviation, and exposed her company to a full operational audit that would examine every maintenance shortcut, every deferred warning, every executive override buried in years of records. She turned to Grant and accused him of using a single small component to destroy her empire. Grant met her gaze and answered that a small component could not destroy an empire, but arrogance could. Preston elaborated on his decision with the thoroughness of a man who wanted his reasoning preserved for the record. A faulty valve could be replaced in a matter of days, he said, and the cost would be negligible against Vailcrest's operating budget. But a corporate culture that dismissed safety warnings, humiliated the people who delivered them, and manipulated maintenance schedules to protect investor optics represented a category of risk that no amount of capital could insure against. Madison received an invitation to join Preston's independent safety review team as an operational witness, a recognition that she had spoken the truth at personal cost. Blaine Ashford was directed to surrender all security logs from the boarding incident for review because his decision to search Grant's bag in the manner he had chosen raised questions about whether private security protocols at Vailcrest exceeded reasonable boundaries. No one needed to shout or threaten. Professional consequences delivered with institutional precision carried more weight than any raised fist. Serafina left the conference room without speaking. No one escorted her out, no one reprimanded her publicly, but the silence that followed her departure pressed against the walls like something physical. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her career, that she had lost not at the moment the investment was withdrawn, but at the moment she had looked at Grant Calloway and decided he was not worth her respect. Grant did not gloat. He collected his canvas bag, placed the fractured valve sample back into its foam case, and signed the chain of custody forms, transferring his documentation to Preston's audit team. For him, the victory had never been about embarrassing a CEO. It had been about keeping a flight on the ground until the ground was ready to let it go. Preston shook Grant's hand and said, "Mr. Calloway, I do not need someone who makes paperwork look pretty. I need someone who makes me sleep well after an aircraft leaves the runway." Several days later, Serafina Kingsley Vale drove to the maintenance hangar where Grant was conducting an inspection on a different aircraft. She arrived alone, no security detail, no assistance, no entourage projecting the illusion of invulnerability that had surrounded her like armor for as long as anyone could remember. She stood in the hangar doorway and looked at the canvas bag sitting on Grant's workbench. The same bag she had ordered searched. The same bag whose contents had been spread across a walnut table for the amusement of people who did not understand what they were looking at. This time she did not touch it, did not ask what was inside, did not presume to know its value by the condition of its fabric. The reversal was complete and visible. The object that had been treated as suspicious was now something a CEO approached with caution. She told Grant that the Valecrest board had suspended her executive authority pending the results of the operational audit. Several charter flights had been canceled while the technical team conducted a fleet-wide inspection of parts sourcing and maintenance protocols, and Whitaker Dominion Capital had formally withdrawn from the investment agreement with no indication of returning. She asked Grant whether he felt satisfied. He answered that he felt only regret because the entire situation could have been resolved quietly if she had listened to Madison's warnings and read the maintenance reports when they first arrived on her desk, instead of treating them as obstacles to her schedule. Serafina tried to justify her decisions by explaining that in her world, a delayed flight could cascade into losses measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. Grant replied that in his world, a single compromised signature could take away someone's chance to correct a mistake, and that the people who bore the consequences were never the ones sitting in the executive suite. The moment carried the emotional weight the story had been building toward. Grant did not humiliate Serafina in return. He did not list her failures or demand contrition. He simply showed her the difference between authority that came from a title and authority that came from refusing to cut corners when cutting corners was the easier path. Serafina offered an apology, and it arrived without theatrical emotion, stripped of the polished delivery she used for shareholders and press conferences. She said she had looked at his bag and believed she knew the value of the person carrying it, and she had been wrong. Grant accepted the words with a nod that was neither forgiving nor bitter. He told her that the apology she owed first belonged to Madison, to the captain, and to the technicians who had been pressured into silence long before he ever set foot on her aircraft. They were the ones who had carried the weight of knowing something was wrong while being told that saying so would cost them everything. Serafina turned and walked toward the hangar exit. Grant watched her go, then opened the canvas bag, took out his worn notebook, and wrote a single line on a new page. Never let the appearance of the person holding the evidence fool the person who needs to hear the truth. 1 month later, Grant Calloway still worked out of the same corrugated metal shop near the airport perimeter, still drove the same pickup truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer, still cleaned his own tools at the end of every shift, and still carried the same faded canvas bag that had started a chain of events no one at Rockwell Ridge Executive Terminal would soon forget. But something had changed in the way people responded when he walked into a hangar or boarded an aircraft for an inspection. The sideways glances and dismissive comments had been replaced by a quiet recognition that the man with the old bag might be carrying something that could determine whether a flight departed or stayed on the ground. Whitaker Dominion Capital had formally retained him as principal safety advisor for a new independent certification initiative, and his recommendations were beginning to reshape how private aviation operators documented their maintenance decisions. Nolan appeared briefly one evening, leaning against the shop doorway while Grant finished logging an inspection, and asked why so many people kept calling, to invite his dad to look at their airplanes. Grant smiled and said that sometimes grown-ups needed someone to remind them they were not allowed to fly until they were ready. The boy accepted the answer with the easy trust of a child who understood that his father's work mattered even when the details were too complicated to explain over dinner. Madison Greer had been promoted to interim director of safety operations at Vailcrest, where she was rebuilding the internal reporting culture from the ground up, creating a system in which technicians could flag concerns without fear of reprisal and maintenance schedules could not be overridden by executive convenience. Serafina Kingsley Vale did not return to the chief executive's chair immediately. She remained under board review while the audit progressed, and the process was teaching her, slowly and without mercy, that the cost of ignoring the people she had dismissed was measured not in days or dollars, but in the institutional trust that takes years to build and moments to destroy. The final scene unfolded at a different terminal on a different morning. Grant walked through the boarding area carrying his canvas bag, and a young executive waiting near the gate glanced at it, with the beginning of a smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. Before the expression could fully take shape, the captain standing beside the executive spoke first. He said to be careful, because whatever was inside that bag might be the reason they were still allowed to fly today. Grant offered a small smile and continued toward the aircraft without stopping, without explaining, without needing to prove that he belonged. Because sometimes the thing that silences an entire cabin is not a weapon, not a fortune, not a gemstone, but a small piece of evidence in the hands of a man who refused to sell the truth for a quieter life.